What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
There's a very specific kind of silence that settles into a person's bones when their own parents don't call them on their birthday. It's not loud or tragic. It doesn't come crashing in like grief or betrayal. It seeps like water through old wood, and before you realize what's happening, you've been soaking in that silence for so long that you start to believe maybe you were never really supposed to feel celebrated in the first place. That was me this year. 39 candles, though I didn't even bother lighting a single one, and the only buzz from my phone all day was a push notification about a 30% off sale on winter coats and an alert from my bank asking if I wanted to approve a recurring transaction. $1,500 to cover my brother Ethan's mortgage. I sat on the edge of my bed that morning, staring at that bank notification for a long time, with my laptop still open from the night before and a half-finished email to my boss about rescheduling a project call. It was cloudy outside. Not that it mattered, I live in Chicago. Clouds are just part of the damn skyline. But there was something about that flat gray light pouring through the blinds that made the emptiness of the day feel heavier. Like it was pressing right down on my chest. The message from my mom came in at 11:32 a.m. Not happy birthday or hope you're doing okay, not even a lazy thinking of you. Just, hey sweetie, can you cover Ethan's mortgage again this month? He's between jobs. Love you. That was it. That was all I got. I stared at the screen like it might change if I waited long enough, like maybe the real message was just loading slower than the rest. But no. Just that single, gut-punching text. And it wasn't even the request itself that broke something in me, it was the normalcy of it. The casual way she asked, as if it had never occurred to her that maybe I'd need something too, or maybe, just once, they could ask Ethan to stand on his own two damn feet. But I didn't reply. I didn't write anything passive-aggressive, didn't guilt them about the forgotten birthday or bring up the string of previous months where I'd sent thousands of dollars without so much as a thank you. I just clicked into my bank app, hovered my thumb over that automatic payment setting, and tapped cancel. It was weirdly quiet after that. Not in the literal sense. The neighbor's dog was barking across the hall and the city was still humming below, but in my head, in my gut, everything just went quiet. I didn't feel guilty, not right away. If anything, I felt this strange, tight calmness. Like something that had been pulling at me for years had finally snapped. And for a couple of days, nothing happened. No follow-up texts, no missed calls. I went to work, I answered emails, I cooked myself dinner. And then, on the third day, just when I'd almost convinced myself that maybe they hadn't even noticed, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in months, Ethan. At first, it was just a series of short texts. Hey, then, did the payment bounce? Then, Rachel, did something happen? All within about 10 minutes of each other. I left them unread. I wanted to give myself space to sit with that silence a little longer, to see what would come out of it if I didn't rush in and fix everything the way I always did. But Ethan didn't stop. By the next day, he was blowing up my phone, voice messages, texts, even a weirdly long rant on Venmo requesting $5 with a note, just to see if you blocked me. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so damn familiar. You see, Ethan has always had this way of collapsing loudly. Anytime something didn't go his way, he lost a job, broke up with a girlfriend, got cut off by one of his sketchy friends, he'd go full fire alarm mode. Meanwhile, I've spent my entire life being the invisible bucket of water trying to put it all out without making a mess. That's how our family works. Ethan explodes, mom and dad panic, and I'm the one quietly cleaning up the debris behind them. I used to think that made me the strong one, the one who could hold it all together. Now I'm starting to realize maybe it just made me complicit. The tone shifted late that night. Around 1 in the morning, I was up scrolling through emails when I saw a new voice message come in. Ethan again. I almost deleted it. But something, maybe curiosity, maybe old habits, made me hit play. His voice was different this time. Slower. Slurred. He was drunk, no doubt about it. But there was a desperation in his words that made me sit up straight. He said, I get it, okay? I get it if you're done. I need to tell you something. I didn't mean for this to come out like this, but I know what they did. I know what happened back then. You don't know the half of it, Ratch. There's stuff you never saw. Stuff they never told you. And it's all connected. The fire, the house, that night in '97. You think they were just cold, just distant? No. It was always about you. You were never supposed to know. I sat frozen, listening. The fire? What fire? I remembered a neighbor's place burning down when we were kids, but what the hell did that have to do with anything? Ethan kept going, his words tumbling over each other, saying things like, they blamed you and he made a deal, and I have proof. But then the message cut off, just static for a second and then silence. I played it twice more, trying to make sense of the pieces, trying to understand what the hell he meant by they blamed you. My chest tightened in that familiar way, like a panic attack sneaking up from behind. But I didn't call him. I didn't ask for clarification. I did something I never do, I waited. I let him stew in that silence too. And sure enough, a few minutes later, another message came in. This time, just a text. It wasn't their house. It was supposed to be ours. And right then, everything inside me shifted. Because that's not the kind of sentence you write by accident. That's the kind of sentence that blows the whole goddamn family myth to pieces. Now, let me ask you something and be honest. If your brother, the one who's bled you dry for years, suddenly started unraveling secrets you didn't even know existed, would you believe him? Would you dig deeper? Or would you keep pretending that everything made sense, just so you didn't have to look at the truth? Because I think I'm about to find out what happens when you finally stop cleaning up after everyone and start asking why the fire started in the first place. The thing about silence is that it doesn't last, not when you've spent your whole life patching up other people's disasters, not when you've become the designated crisis manager for your own family. The one who always shows up no matter how many times they've forgotten your birthday, missed your graduations, or conveniently disappeared when it came time to offer something other than criticism or guilt. I had told myself that canceling that mortgage payment wasn't an act of war, that it was simply a quiet boundary drawn after years of being emotionally and financially drained. But somewhere deep down, I must have known that the minute I pulled the plug, the entire rotten structure that had been built on top of my silence would start to crack. Ethan didn't stop texting. After the drunken voice message and that haunting sentence, it wasn't their house. It was supposed to be ours. He went quiet for almost a full day, and for a moment, I thought maybe he'd passed out and forgotten the whole thing. Maybe it was just another one of his alcohol-fueled attempts at emotional manipulation. But then, just before midnight, a flood of messages came in so fast my phone lit up like a slot machine stuck on jackpot. First it was nonsense, half-coherent rambling, sentences that didn't finish, thoughts that circled back on themselves, everything wrapped in this frenzied energy that felt both desperate and threatening. And then, like the eye of a storm, one message came and that was calm. Sober. Almost chilling in its clarity. I was there the night of the fire, he wrote. You were already asleep. You don't remember it right, but I do. I saw Dad talking to that man, Mark something, and I heard Mom crying in the kitchen. They said it would change everything. That it would buy us out of this life. That they couldn't go back. And then 2 weeks later, the neighbor's house burned down and the insurance money was gone and no one ever talked about it again. It was the kind of text you have to read twice, not because you don't understand it the first time, but because your brain refuses to believe that something that dark, that heavy, could have been quietly simmering just beneath the surface of your own childhood without you ever noticing. I sat there in the half-darkness of my apartment, rereading the words as if staring hard enough would rearrange them into something less insane. Because what was he saying? That our parents had something to do with the fire? That they tried to burn our own house down but someone else's caught fire instead? That the guilt they carried, the strange detachment they always directed toward me, wasn't just about old family roles or unspoken resentments, but something deeper, something more intentional? I tried to remember that night. I would have been 10, maybe 11. I had this vague memory of waking up to sirens, of the air smelling like burnt plastic, of our backyard glowing orange through the curtains. But in my mind, it had always just been the neighbor's house, Mr. Patterson, who worked nights at the factory and had a Saint Bernard that drooled on everyone. The idea that there had been a plan, that my family might have been at the center of something criminal, something buried under years of forced smiles and icy Thanksgivings, was too much to process all at once. Ethan kept texting. I found the file, he wrote. The one Dad kept in the garage, in that rusted metal cabinet. It had receipts, a copy of the old insurance policy, even a letter from some lawyer named Harris, saying the claim had been denied due to suspicious circumstances. That's why we lost everything. That's why we had to move. You thought it was just about Dad getting laid off. It wasn't. And then, the part that stopped me cold. They said it was your fault. That you left the stove on. That if they hadn't covered for you, you'd have been taken away. The room spun a little as I read that last line. My stomach dropped like I'd just missed a step in the dark. That accusation, that quiet bomb of a sentence, hit something I didn't even know was raw. I had never remembered leaving anything on that night. I'd never been accused of anything, not directly, not aloud. But suddenly, a million small moments from my childhood started rearranging themselves into a new and sinister pattern. The way Mom always triple-checked the kitchen at night, even when I was a teenager. The way Dad never let me near the gas knobs again. The way they both looked at me with that strange stiffness whenever someone brought up that house fire. I thought it was just their way of processing trauma. I thought they were cold because they didn't know how to love properly. But now I was starting to realize something far worse. Maybe they weren't cold. Maybe they were hiding. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I called in sick, though my voice was too steady to sound convincing, and I spent the day digging through old family boxes I had stashed in the closet. Birthday cards, report cards, photo albums, nothing overtly suspicious, but everything suddenly felt suspect. Every smiling face in every Polaroid looked like a mask. I called Ethan. He didn't answer. I tried again 2 hours later. Still nothing. And then, finally, around 4 in the afternoon, he texted. If you want the truth, come talk to me. I have it all. The file, the letters, everything. But I'm not sending it over text. You have to come here. You have to see it for yourself. He dropped a pin to a seedy motel on the edge of Joliet, the kind of place you don't end up in unless you're running from something or hiding something worse. I stared at the screen for a long time, the blue dot blinking like it was daring me to find out who I really was, who my parents really were. I didn't want to go. Every instinct told me to delete the messages, block his number, pour a glass of wine, and pretend none of this had happened. But the truth was already worming its way into my brain, refusing to be buried. And somewhere in the pit of my stomach, I knew, if I didn't go, if I didn't face Ethan and whatever the hell he thought he had, I'd never sleep again. So I packed a bag, locked the door, and started driving. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not that anyone would ask. Not that anyone would care. The only thought repeating in my head was a question I wasn't ready to answer. What if Ethan was telling the truth? And what if the truth was worse than anything I'd ever imagined? There's something about a run-down roadside motel that makes you question every decision you've made in your life leading up to that moment. The buzzing neon vacancy sign barely clinging to life above the entrance, the gravel parking lot cracked and crumbling beneath your feet, and the unmistakable scent of mildew and old cigarette smoke that hits you the moment you open your car door, all of it conspiring to tell you that you've officially crossed some kind of line between your old life and whatever the hell this new chapter is supposed to be. I sat behind the wheel for a full 5 minutes, staring at the peeling green paint on the motel door Ethan said he was behind, wondering if there was still time to turn around, to pretend none of this had ever happened, to drive straight back to my apartment and bury myself in a spreadsheet or a bottle of wine or any other version of life that didn't involve secrets from the 90s and drunken revelations from a brother who'd spent most of his adult life chasing one failure after another. But of course, I didn't turn around, because some part of me, whether it was the part that needed closure, or the part that still stupidly believed in family even after all the years of being let down, needed to look Ethan in the eyes and ask him, out loud, if he really meant what he said, if he was sober now and still stood by those texts about the fire, about the lie, about the night our family's fragile little illusion cracked and never quite healed. I knocked once, twice, and then the door creaked open without a word, revealing a dimly lit room that looked exactly as sad as I had expected, yellowed lampshades, stained carpet, and Ethan, slumped on the edge of a sagging bed. wearing an oversized hoodie that may have once been gray but now looked more like ash. He didn't say hello. He didn't make a joke. He just nodded at a dusty chair in the corner and said, "You came," like he was as surprised as I was that I actually showed up. I sat without answering, letting the silence stretch out between us, letting him feel the weight of it, because for once I wasn't here to comfort or to smooth things over or to carry his shame for him. I was here for the truth, or at least the version of it he was finally willing to give. He reached down beside the bed and pulled out a shoebox, not even a proper folder or briefcase, just a battered Nike box held together with duct tape and the kind of desperation that people like Ethan carried with them their whole lives. When he opened it, the smell of old paper hit me first: mildew, ink, dust, maybe even gasoline if I let my mind wander too far. He didn't look at me when he handed me the first item, just stared at the stained motel carpet like the answers were written in its cigarette burns. It was a letter, typed, yellowing at the edges, with the letterhead of a law firm I didn't recognize, Harris and Morton, Fire Damage Litigation Division, dated August 23, 1997. The letter was addressed to my father, formally declining an insurance payout due to inconsistencies in the filed claim, lack of evidence regarding the cause of damage, and the conflicting statements from household members, which, according to the legalese, meant that they didn't believe the fire had been accidental or properly reported. I read it twice, the words twisting into something darker each time, and when I looked up at Ethan, he was already handing me a second document, an insurance policy, for a property listed at 362 High Ridge Drive, issued just 2 months before the fire, with my father's signature scrawled across the bottom and a policy value of $120,000. The address wasn't ours. I stared at it, confused, until Ethan finally spoke. "That's the house they were gonna buy," he said, his voice flat. "That's the one they wanted. The house we were supposed to move into before school started. Dad was working construction back then. Mom was pregnant with the twins, you remember, right? Before she lost them." He paused, and I felt the air shift, felt something heavy pass between us in the name he didn't say. They said it was time to move up, that we were getting out of the apartment, getting away from all the noise, the city. They had it all figured out. But then the loan didn't go through. Dad's credit was crap. They couldn't swing it. But he found a workaround. A shortcut. He pulled out a photo next, bent at the edges, faded from years of handling. It was a picture of the front of a modest ranch-style house with a chain-link fence and a car in the driveway that I vaguely remembered from a childhood visit to someone's house. I had assumed it was a relative, maybe a friend of my parents. But now, Ethan said something that made the room tilt sideways. "That's the house that burned down. The one you thought belonged to Mr. Patterson. Only thing is, it didn't belong to him. He was renting. Dad insured it under his name for 2 months, said he was doing some handyman work there, that he was helping renovate it for the owners. But the owners didn't exist. The paperwork was fake. The whole thing was a setup." I couldn't breathe for a second. The idea that my father, a man who could barely remember to pay the electric bill on time, a man who once returned a stolen lawn chair out of guilt, had orchestrated a fake insurance policy and burned a house down for cash was so far outside the version of him I had always carried in my head that my brain refused to compute it. But then Ethan pulled out one last thing, a check stub, faded and torn, made out to Mark Spiller, $5,000, dated 1 week after the fire. I looked at the name, confused, and Ethan met my eyes for the first time that day. "That's the guy Dad paid to light it up," he said. Only Spiller backed out at the last second. Got scared. Patterson was out of town that night, remember? But someone had already lit the match. And that someone wasn't Dad. I didn't understand. I shook my head, demanding he say it, needing him to finish the thought. "It was Mom," he said. "She did it. She thought she was protecting you. Said if she didn't go through with it, Dad was going to do something worse. Something that couldn't be undone." The silence that followed was different than all the others before it. This one wasn't about guilt or expectation or resentment. This one was about horror. The kind that lingers in the corners of memory, the kind that rewrites your entire understanding of your own history in one slow, sickening wave. And then Ethan said the one thing I hadn't expected, maybe the only thing that could make the rest of this make even less sense. She wasn't just trying to save you from Dad. She was trying to save him from himself. The air in the room felt thick enough to choke on. My hands were trembling, my heart pounding so loud I was sure the neighbors could hear it through the walls. I wanted to ask 100 questions. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But all I could do was sit there, that check stub in my hand, that name, Mark Spiller, burned into my brain like a second fire that hadn't yet been put out. Whatever this was, whatever this had become, it wasn't just about a canceled mortgage payment anymore. It wasn't about a forgotten birthday. It wasn't even about family dysfunction. This was a goddamn crime story. And I was the only one left who didn't know the ending. But that was about to change. There are moments when the fabric of everything you thought you understood about your own life begins to loosen, slowly at first, like the fraying edge of a childhood sweater you never stopped wearing out of obligation, and then, almost without warning, the whole thing starts to unravel all at once, revealing a version of your past that feels more like someone else's twisted story than the reality you've quietly endured for decades. That was the place I found myself sitting in the day after I left that motel, staring down at the crumpled check stub Ethan had handed me. The name Mark Spiller burned into my mind like the lingering smell of gasoline in an empty garage, unmistakable, undeniable, and somehow connected to a truth I wasn't prepared to swallow. Not yet, not alone, not after everything else that had been unearthed. I didn't sleep that night, or if I did, it was the kind of fractured half-sleep where your body rests, but your brain won't stop spinning, playing the same scenes over and over like a scratched cassette tape stuck in an endless loop. I kept hearing Ethan's voice, his hoarse whisper, his barely concealed bitterness, his quiet, devastating claim that our mother had lit the match herself. I didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it, but the more I tried to convince myself that this had to be some elaborate misunderstanding, some broken man fantasy stitched together from guilt and booze, the more I kept circling back to all the strange behaviors, all the odd silences, all the decisions that had never made sense until now. My parents had never treated me like I belonged entirely to them, but I had always assumed that was about me, that I was somehow difficult to love, that I hadn't measured up to the version of a daughter they had imagined when they chose to keep me. What I hadn't considered until now was the possibility that it hadn't been about who I was at all, but about what I reminded them of. When I finally opened my laptop the next morning, the search was automatic, mechanical, like something my hands had already decided to do before my brain had caught up. I typed Mark Spiller into the search bar with the kind of detached numbness usually reserved for medical test results or obituary notices, already bracing myself for what I might find. At first, it was nothing, just a handful of scattered mentions, a high school yearbook photo from the 80s, a court docket buried in the archives of a Joliet courthouse, and then finally, a property record that listed him as the owner of a small one-story home just 30 miles southwest of the city, with a photo that made my breath catch in my throat, not because I recognized him, but because he looked like someone who could have lived 3 lifetimes and still never found peace in any of them. The man in the picture was in his 70s now, hunched slightly in a wheelchair with oxygen tubes running from his nose to a tank strapped to the back of the chair, a faded navy cap perched crookedly on his head. His eyes sunken and his face a roadmap of everything life had taken from him. There was something both haunted and haunting about the way he stared into the camera, and though I had never met him before in my life, I knew in the marrow of my bones that this man had seen something the rest of us weren't supposed to see. And more than that, I knew he had seen my parents. The drive to his house was long, mostly quiet, a patchwork of cracked highways and lonely cornfields, the kind of drive that gives you too much time to think, to second guess, to rehearse 1,000 different ways to ask a stranger if he was the missing piece of the story your brother swore was true. By the time I pulled up to his address, an aging ranch-style home nestled behind a crooked fence and an overgrown yard, I was shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of what I might be about to learn. The front door was already cracked open when I knocked, and a woman in scrubs, likely his caretaker, nodded at me like she'd been expecting someone who wouldn't quite explain why they were there. She didn't ask questions. She just stepped aside and said, "He's out back. Said to let you through." I found him sitting on a rusted metal porch chair in the backyard, wrapped in a blanket even though the August heat was still clinging to the air, his gnarled hands folded in his lap like someone waiting to be judged. He didn't smile, didn't flinch, just looked at me with those hollow eyes and said, "You must be Rachel," as if he'd been waiting for me all these years. I sat across from him without speaking, the silence between us thick and sticky, filled with 1,000 questions I didn't know how to ask. Finally, I said the only thing I could manage. "Did you know my parents?" He nodded slowly, the motion labored, like each movement cost him something. "I knew your mother," he said, his voice gravelly and broken, the words curling out of his mouth like smoke. "I knew her better than your father did. Knew her before she became what she became." I waited, heart hammering in my chest. "She came to me with a job," he continued, "back in '97. Said it was quick money. Said no one would get hurt. She looked me in the eyes and told me she needed this for her family, that it was the only way to start over, to give her kids a life she never had." I was stupid enough to believe her. Or maybe I just wanted to believe her. Hell, I'd been in love with her since 1984, when we worked together on that kitchen remodel on Hill Street. I blinked, trying to process what I was hearing. "You loved her?" I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. He laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that turned quickly into a cough. "I was your father, Rachel. Your real one. Not the man who raised you. Not the one whose name is on your birth certificate. But the one who was there before she walked away from everything." The ground beneath me shifted again, that awful tilting feeling returning like a wave of vertigo that no amount of preparation could have cushioned. My throat went dry, my vision blurred at the edges, and still, he kept talking. "She told me once that if she ever had a daughter, she'd name her Rachel, after her grandmother. She told me that she'd make sure her little girl would never have to live like she did. And then, after you were born, she disappeared. Married him. Told me to keep quiet, that it was better this way. That he could give you a name. A future. I should have fought harder, but I didn't. And then the fire happened." He turned his head slightly, stared out over the brown grass like he was seeing a different year, a different life. "I never lit it. I couldn't. I backed out at the last second. She told me she'd take care of it. Said it was already in motion. I didn't believe her. I thought she was bluffing. Until I read about it in the paper." I sat there, shaking, the weight of everything finally crashing into me, my parents' coldness, Ethan's rage, my mother's distance, my father's resentment, the eerie way they both seemed to look past me rather than at me. Everything suddenly made a twisted kind of sense, not the kind that brought peace, but the kind that felt like a gut punch from the universe, a confirmation that your whole life had been a performance on someone else's stage. "I'm sorry," he said finally, voice cracking like glass under pressure. "I should have come sooner. I should have told you. But I didn't know how." I didn't respond. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, surrounded by the dying weeds and the smoke of a 28-year-old lie, and thought about how sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes the truth just buries you deeper. And as I stood to leave, without promising to come back, without offering forgiveness, he said one last thing that chilled me more than anything else that day. "They told Ethan everything years ago. He just never told you." And with that, I realized the final betrayal hadn't come from my parents. It had come from the only person I thought might still be on my side. There is a particular kind of rage that doesn't explode or scream or rip through rooms in a blaze of drama, but instead settles deep into your stomach like rusted iron, heavy and cold and unmovable. The kind of rage that doesn't want revenge in the traditional sense, but simply wants silence, pure, undisturbed, unbreakable silence, and it was that exact kind of rage that kept me company as I drove home from Mark Spiller's house, the truth gnawing at the edges of my thoughts like termites working their way through every beam of identity I thought I could count on. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't call anyone. I didn't even replay the conversation in my head because I didn't need to. The words were already carved into me, and there was no amount of distraction or denial that could unwrite what had been exposed in that tired backyard, under that wide, indifferent sky, with a man who claimed not only to know me, but to have loved me from a distance longer than I'd been alive. I got home to find 3 missed calls from Ethan, 2 voice messages I didn't bother opening, and 1 long, panic text that started with "I didn't know how to tell you" and ended with "please don't hate me," the kind of message that might have worked on me a year ago, or even a month ago, but now read like the scripted panic of someone who's realized too late that the game they were playing had rules they never fully understood. I set the phone face down on the counter, poured myself a drink I wouldn't finish, and opened the shoebox he'd given me once more, not because I needed to see the documents again, but because I needed to confirm, to remind myself, that none of this was a fevered dream, that the signatures were real, that the letters weren't forged, that the check stub existed, that I wasn't inventing a nightmare just to justify the exhaustion that had been building in me for most of my adult life. For years, I had blamed myself for being distant, cold, impatient with my family's dysfunction. I had told myself I was just the different one, the one who never quite fit, the one who was too serious or too ambitious or too allergic to chaos to belong among people who operated like a fire was always burning somewhere in the background. But now I understood that it wasn't me they had failed to understand, it was the truth they had failed to reveal, the guilt they had quietly carried and projected back onto me, punishing me for reminding them of a past they had buried so thoroughly that they forgot I had been built from its bones. I spent the rest of that night scanning everything, every letter, every photograph, every document, carefully, meticulously, as if archiving a crime scene that had been hidden in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. I made 3 identical folders on 3 different USB drives and labeled each one with the same 2 words, "Read this." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was just necessary. One drive went into an envelope addressed to my mother, another to my father, and the third I sent by courier to Ethan, not out of spite, but out of a strange, resigned sense of symmetry. He had held this story for years, and now he could hold it again, this time knowing I knew everything. I didn't write a note. I didn't attach a message. I didn't ask questions or offer forgiveness. I just sent the evidence and waited for the silence. It arrived quickly. My parents didn't respond. Not with rage or denial or shame or even surprise. Nothing. Not a call. Not a text. Not a single word. The silence from their side was so complete, so immediate, that it almost confirmed the truth better than any admission ever could. They weren't shocked. They weren't caught off guard. They had simply been waiting for the day when I'd find out. And when that day came, they did exactly what people like them always do. They vanished behind their own denial and let the silence speak for them. Ethan, though, he didn't disappear. Not entirely. For a while, he tried everything: guilt-laced voice messages, teary admissions, blurry late-night photos of handwritten letters I never asked for, long confessions that pinged into my phone like desperate sonar calls from someone who had finally realized the boat had left the harbor without him. His last text arrived 10 days after I sent the envelope. It was simple, not dramatic or poetic, just raw and small and strangely honest. They said you were the mistake they couldn't afford. That you reminded them of the thing they did. They told me to protect you. But I didn't. I just kept taking from you, like they did. I'm sorry. I stared at the message for a long time, not because I was debating how to respond, but because I realized I didn't need to respond at all. Some things don't require answers. Some apologies come too late to matter, and others are simply acknowledgments, not acts of healing, not invitations to reconnect, just the final footnote at the end of a chapter that never should have been written in the first place. And so I did what I should have done years ago. I hit block. On Ethan. On my mother. On my father. I erased the family group chat, deleted every birthday reminder I had ever set for people who had forgotten mine more times than I could count, and removed every payment link, every calendar notification. Every automatic transaction that had once tethered me to their chaos like a leash I hadn't noticed was there until it left a permanent bruise around my neck. It didn't feel like vengeance. It didn't even feel like closure. It just felt quiet. And after so many years of being the one to answer, to apologize, to fix, the quiet was the most powerful thing I had left to give. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail. Not an email, not a text, but an actual letter, scrawled in Ethan's handwriting, on the kind of lined yellow paper we used to use for school essays, folded unevenly and sent with no return address. I almost threw it away. But something stopped me. Curiosity, maybe. Nostalgia. Or just the simple, human ache of knowing that no matter how deep the betrayal, the heart still searches for an ending. Inside, he wrote that he was moving. That he didn't know where yet, just somewhere south, somewhere without snow, and that he wasn't asking for forgiveness, wasn't expecting reconciliation. But he wanted me to know that he had finally told the truth to someone else, an old friend, a woman he once loved, someone who still answered his calls. And that maybe one day, if I ever changed my mind, he'd be somewhere warm and sober and waiting. He ended with a question I couldn't answer, not then, maybe not ever. Do you still think of me as your brother? Or just another part of the story you had to survive? I folded the letter back up, slid it into the drawer where I kept loose batteries and expired coupons, and walked away. Not because I was angry. Not because I needed revenge. But because sometimes survival doesn't come with closure. Sometimes survival is just the quiet act of choosing your own peace over someone else's chaos, again and again, until the people who once defined your pain become nothing more than characters in a story you no longer feel the need to finish. And as I sat alone that evening, with the sun disappearing behind the buildings, casting long, sharp shadows across my quiet little apartment, I found myself thinking not about the fire or the lies, or even Ethan's final words, but about something far simpler. Something my mother once said to me years ago, when I was just a girl trying to make sense of why everything always felt just a little off. She said, "Some truths aren't meant to be spoken out loud, Rachel. They're meant to be understood in silence." For the first time in my life, I understood what she meant. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to reply.